And you can't even drive? I can. Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool? Well, why can't you drive then? You can't even drive! A bit grey today, isn't it?
I'm here. Welcome everyone to another edition of The Deepest Lore. I hope you all have your hot and cold beverages at the ready, because today we're going to be talking about Andy Warhol. And joining me is my esteemed guest, Mr. D. How are you doing today, D?
Hello. I'm doing reasonably well.
And we're going to talk about Warhol today. When did you first start getting interested in Warhol yourself?
Well, I remember his death, which was in 1987. I remember hearing about that, and I was certainly kind of familiar with, sort of the most well-known work. I've also been going to various art museums and such, for most of my life. So I think I was aware of him early. I started to become interested in him when I was a teenager, and I received copies of a couple of his books because he published quite a number of books, including a diary. And so I think it's been a very long running interest of mine.
Yeah, and so you've prepared quite literally hundreds of images for this stream, and presumably there's a narrative through line to these images. So why don't you tell us what we're looking at right now?
Well, yes, there is a narrative. We're kind of not going chronologically. We're sort of going chronologically, not totally. But I thought we just talk briefly about the origins of Andy Warhol. He actually was not born Andy Warhol. He was born Andrew Warholer. And this is a photograph of him and his brother. He's the smallest one there, and his mother. He was born in 1928. So, as I think we've talked about before, many of the people we kind of associate with the culture of the 1960s were, in fact, kind of, the previous generation, and so that's very much the case with Warhol. He was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and if you know anything about kind of American history and sort of the American regions, Pittsburgh was very much a kind of industrial city. There's coal mines in Pennsylvania, and there was lots of sort of industry at the time.
Steel
family,
workers, dockers.
Yeah, steel workers. In fact, his father was a coal worked in a coal mine. His family were actually first generation immigrants from what is today part of Slovakia, I think. They're called Lemkos. These his particular sort of cultural group. His mother spoke Czech almost exclusively. I mean, she could speak English, but not terribly well. So he was really a kind of product of Eastern European culture, very much.
And interesting. Yeah, Pittsburgh is a very blue collar town. I happen to know from my wrestling knowledge. I know a lot of the wrestlers came from that area. Also, all immigrants as well. There was a guy called Polish Power, Ivan Putski, who was from around that area.
I've heard.
Sammartino. Yeah.
Yes, and of course, these were very much kind of working class. I would say not poor, but certainly not economically advantaged in any way. And yes, I mean, I would say his origins were quite humble. He had a number of brothers. I think two brothers, and also I think another thing of note that will come up several times in the stream is that he grew up what's called Ruthenian Orthodox Catholic. So his family were kind of Eastern Rite Catholics. He attended church in Pittsburgh, and it was an Eastern Rite Catholic church, and so I don't know terribly much about it, but certainly I would say the traditions of the church were very much more like the Orthodox, the more familiar Orthodox traditions that we know.
Presumably, this picture we're looking at here, he's the one right in the middle.
Yes.
Yeah, because he's recognizably Andy Warhol there.
Yeah, and of course his appearance will change quite dramatically, as we'll see. I mean, I think it's very important to understand that this person, Andrew Warhol, is intimately related to the character that we kind of know as the artist, but it's also very distinctly different people. And I think the idea of a kind of imago, the sort of image, the icon, as opposed to the kind of person in the biographical sense, they're very different things, and I think a very important kind of thread in his work as well.
So,
anyway,
so you're saying that Andy Warhol was a conscious persona and an artistic statement in and of itself all the way through.
Very, very much so, yeah. And then we'll see that developing, as we go on. If you go on to the next one, this is a work. I think this is from 1948, and so this is a work he did. His father died when he was a teenager, and so his brothers were very much kind of took on the kind of role in the family, and I think him as the youngest child, it was sort of decided that he had these talents in art and design, and so he would attend college, which none of the other children and none of his other siblings had done. This the sort of artistic, kind of aesthetic sense was very much kind of manifest from an early age. And the other thing to sort of take note is I've been talking with various people as I've been preparing these materials for the stream, and quite a number of people, when they've seen clips and heard things about him, have kind of described Warhol as the kind of ultimate autistic person. And you'll sort of see what I mean. But I mean, he was sort of touched in a certain way, and I think that was something that also kind of really guided his sensibilities and the development of this kind of persona, which was sort of, I think, both a kind of deliberate project, but also a kind of armor, a kind of protective armor. He had quite a serious medical condition when he was a child, which was a result of, I think, rheumatic fever or scarlet fever, and so he was sort of literally bedridden for quite a period of months in his life, and he recalled, actually quite enjoying that, because he liked to be alone. He liked to sort of read, and he was very much interested in kind of reading his mother's kind of celebrity magazines and newspapers and listening to the radio and such. I mean, he was very much a kind of lone and sort of internally self-directed person. So I think I'm sort of, I don't have a lot of kind of interest in the kind of juvenilia, but I think that is an important kind of foundation for where he would go.
No, Dee, this early piece that we're looking at here reminds me a little bit of Matisse. Is that what Warhol's going for here?
I don't know if he's going for Matisse. I mean, he certainly would have been aware of of Matisse and certain developments of modernism, but it's also very much in kind of a kind of American vernacular. I mean, this is not an idealized room. I mean, this is the sort of the living room of his family home, and that there's very clear sort of signs about the nature of this room. That it's sort of rumpled. The lampshades. I mean, it's very much a lived-in room, and a lived-in room of the kind of class and place where he was from. So, I mean, although it may be a kind of tip towards towards things that had been happening in art, I mean, it's also, I think, quite honest. And I would say this is a pretty advanced piece. I mean, the kind of spatial and decorative arrangement and the arrangement of color here, I mean, it's quite a precocious a piece of art, and I can certainly see why they all agree that he should go to design school. Now, keep in mind, he had no intention of becoming a fine artist at this point. I mean, it was always the idea that he would learn to become a kind of graphic artist, a commercial artist, an illustrator. He didn't have, as far as I've ever read or ever heard from him, from sources related to him, didn't have any kind of aspirations to be a kind of, quote, serious artist in the sense that we think of today, and sort of that character hadn't fully been formed. I mean, there wasn't this idea that you would go and become a famous art star at this point. In fact, he as later on in his life sort of did a lot to create this idea of the artist as celebrity, and there was certainly a bit of that with people like Picasso and others around the time. But keep in mind that the kind of goals and aims at this point in his life would have been quite humble.
Okay, shall I move on?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a young, slightly awkward-looking Andy there.
Well, slightly awkward is that's gonna be a theme you will notice throughout. Yeah, him and his mother. And you can go on. A lot of these are kind of made to pop through quite quickly.
Do I spot the start of a mincing gait there with his little bow tie?
Oh, I think the mincing gait started well before this. But we're kind of skipping ahead, and so young Andrew Warhol, with a friend of his from Carnegie, he went to Carnegie Art Institute, and which is in Pittsburgh, and so of course he did quite well there. Was apparently quite a capable student. And when he had finished his schooling, he did what most people in America, certainly who wanted to get into advertising and commercial art and such, did at that point, which is that you went to New York, and that's very much that was very much a kind of a staple of the time. If you wanted any kind of career of that nature, you really had to go where the industry was, and that was certainly New York when it came to commercial art. And so he and a friend of his from Carnegie Tech, Philip Pearlstein, who went on to become a quite noted figurative artist, basically just packed a few things in the car and drove to New York. And this was a time when you could actually, when like normal, people just trying to get a start could actually live there. It was not the kind of one of the imperial cities at that point, and if you had some friends, some colleagues, you could live very, very cheaply at this point, and we're talking about, I would say, the early 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s.
You think in the kind of biographies of people who became famous in the 60s, I mean, it, you know, I think the Bob Dylan one, in many cases.
You're roboting. You're roboting a bit, eh?
Sorry. Yeah.
Still roboty.
Oh, yeah. How about now?
I think I can hear you. Hello. Ooh, I think we've lost him. Have we lost you? Oh, there's two of them. Mr. Agent? Yeah, stand by, ladies and gentlemen. All right, I've popped open the chat if anyone wants to. Anyone has any questions or anything I'm sort of not covering. I realize a bit of a rocky start. Yeah, we're going to discuss everything. Every bit of work that you associate with Warhol, we will discuss. I did scroll up a bit, and I saw people mentioning that early painting of the living room had a Vincent van Gogh influence, and that's certainly true, and it's something I should have mentioned. I mean, very clearly, the bedroom at all painting by Van Gogh is clearly also an influence there. Not Lambda, no, there wasn't. I mean, there were hardly art scenes anywhere at all at this point. I mean, we're talking about the 1940s, and yeah, I mean, a lot of the ideas that we have about kind of contemporary art, contemporary fine art, especially sort of big ticket, sort of, avant-garde art, came from things that Warhol did later on. So yeah, it didn't exist. I mean, there obviously were kind of wealthy people and collectors and such in Pittsburgh because it was an industrial town, and so there would have been, some semblance of society there. But the art world in terms of fine art and painting was a very, very small world at that time. It was really very localized and very small. So yeah, there wouldn't have been much of a scene, and you certainly couldn't have had a career. Probably, much of a career as a commercial artist either. You would have had it would have been a very sort of low end career.
Right.
Hello. Yeah.
Sorry, I have now moved. As you know, I'm at my parents' place at the moment, and I had to change the room I was in. So I'm now sitting bizarrely on a rocking chair. So you've got to picture me sitting on a rocking chair with my laptop on a sofa, if you can picture that. Okay, and I'm going to have to put my pop filter away because it's come off. Okay, so just as I was, I had to move. I'm not living with my parents. I've come back to visit them due to various reasons. Damn it. Right. Okay. Sorry. My. Okay. I'm trying to get comfortable here. All right. So, what I was going to say, Dee, before is that I noticed in the is of lots of people. I always find it quite like. I mean.
Oh, I hate to say it, but you're breaking up again. Yeah, I'm getting the roboting again.
All right, carry on, Dee.
Okay. Let's see. Where were we? We were looking at that image of that one there. Someone asked why is he dressed like an office worker? Well, I mean, this is the early 1950s, and everyone sort of. I mean, this was an age when people still sort of dressed to a certain standard. I mean, you would have worn a tie and a jacket, no matter who you were, what strata of life you were, where you went. We've skipped ahead a bit. I mean, Warhol very quickly, when he went to New York, he sort of started to get work as an illustrator and a commercial artist, and he very quickly became a well-known and quite successful commercial artist. It really didn't take him very many years to establish himself in New York, and by the end of the 1950s, he really was the kind of a preeminent commercial artist in New York. And he very much had a kind of style that was associated with him, and which was very influential in the field. So yes, he is certainly not a case of the kind of starving artist. Again, he had no designs to be a quote sort of fine artist or a serious artist at this point. He was very much focused on his career in the advertising industry, and he did very well at it. And in fact, by the end of the 1950s, he was already a fairly wealthy man. And this is him again as he changed his name to Warhol when he moved to New York, because as many people do, I think that there was a desire to kind of slightly remove the ethnic flavor from his surname. So even in his commercial career, he became Andy Warhol at this point. Now, as you can see in this picture, he still doesn't have his trademark look. Some things about him will change as we go on. He was prematurely lost his hair. His hair receded quite seriously, and that also became a concern for him, and we'll sort of show how that related to the development of this persona that came with his second career. But yes, I mean, he'd already very self-consciously branded himself even when he was a commercial artist. Hello, AA.
God's sake, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, what I've been trying to say all this time, I've now moved to a third location, is one of the things that fascinates me about this period is the ease with which people just kind of up sticks and move. People always say, well, I packed up my suitcase and I rode straight away. And that, like, literally that's all they did, turned up in New York with, some luggage and basically like made their way. That sort of story is almost impossible now. Whereas in this era, it seemed to be like basically any success story you can think of. It's just like people just going to pursue their dreams in this way,
Yep, and you're absolutely right. The story with Warhol would be completely impossible, and the story with many people that you know. I mean, you just can't do this anymore. And I think the world is over the past few decades. I think that it's quite deliberately been fashioned so that this type of mobility isn't really an option anymore. And also, as I said, everything was quite so much smaller. You know, I mean, this was really slightly before the kind of mass era, the era of mass media and mass communications. You know, I mean, it certainly started by this time, but you know, there was still a kind of a simplicity to life. And yes, you very literally you could just go to New York with a dream. You go to all the idea of going to Hollywood, you know, going wherever. You could do that, and you with very little money you could get by. And if you had ambition and talent, you could make it. And I just don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, there's so many people in these, in these areas. There's so much competition, and there's so much kind of control coming from elsewhere that it's just impossible.
Yeah, there's also something of the randomness that I can't ever see happening, like in my life, for example, like I mean, I mentioned Bob Dylan, like the story where he just packs up his bag and goes to find Woody Guthrie. It's like, what? You're just going to go and look for him in the hospital then? All right, okay then.
Yeah.
People don't really do that sort of randomness anymore. And I think it's part of like having a much more structured and funneled way of, the stories we told about leaving school and just going to university because it was expected type thing. There seemed to be much less of a sense of like what the expected pipeline was in those days as well.
Yes, and I mean, like as I said, Warhol was sort of the first person to go to, sort of have higher education in his family, but he was guided towards that because he had quite a manifest talent and a quite, I would say, quite competitive drive to make use of that talent. I mean, it wasn't just like, oh, what is weird little Andy going to do? Let's send him to art school. I mean, that wasn't a thing back then. So yeah, very different milieu. All right, you want to, yeah. This is again Warhol, the ad man. Young Andy Warhol.
Look at those cars! Wow,
I know, it's amazing, right? Very much out of time. That this picture could be any time from the, I mean, it's very clearly the early 1950s, but that kind of classic image of New York, I think is very much in play here. The shoes. Yeah.
So this is when he's working in the graphic design ad department.
And I just want to explain briefly. This little drawing here is a way to kind of show a technique which he became famous for. This what you see here is that the sort of scrap of paper on the right. He would have made the original draw. Am I alone again?
No, I'm here.
Oh, you're there. Okay, good. Yeah.
I'll mute myself so you can't hear me fiddling.
Okay. So the piece of paper on the right, he would have done the original drawing, in kind of graphite pencil, whatever, and then he would tape this drawing onto another piece of paper, and using ink and a pen or brush, he would do the sort of final ink outline on the pencil drawing. And as he was doing that, he would periodically flip the piece of paper that he was inking and press it against the other piece of paper to blot the liquid ink onto it. And then he would pull it out and ink some more and then push it over and blot it, and back and forth and back and forth. And so what you would get, it's a little more difficult to see on this one because he's doing it on top of a kind of gold embellishment. But if you go to the next slide, And that this is another one, and so you get this very kind of distinctive, rough, kind of blotty looking line on the left there, and the left would be this is an unfinished one, but the left one would be the kind of final drawing. And so this it seems like a very simple thing, but this was kind of a very distinctive look of his commercial and graphical work, and it became very influential. I mean, it was again an era where you sort of distinguish yourself with a kind of style like this, and it became a look that was quite fashionable, and you could kind of think of, certainly in America, 50s adverts that start to have this kind of look, and that was one, I think, innovation that came from him. The other thing to remember, or the other thing to think about, is that this is also the beginning of a kind of lifelong obsession with the idea of removing oneself, removing himself from the product, taking a step back. In other words, it's of course a hand drawing, and he was a very talented draftsman with a very sort of peculiar and whimsical style, but it's also kind of, again, a step removed from his hand. I mean, he's literally doing a primitive, almost printmaking process. I mean, this would be called a monotype type process, and again, it's sort of removing himself, removing the kind of human touch, literally, from a drawing. And I think that this is something you'll see in the work later on, again and again and again. Does that make sense?
Yes, makes sense to me. I've now switched it on to these ladies' feet and shoes.
Yes, and this is, again, and just another. These are the next are all just kind of random images from his commercial days. I mean, his biggest client was a firm called I. Miller, which was a shoe manufacturer, and shoes and feet were an abiding interest of Mr. Warhol. I mean, make of that what you want, but you will see that theme appear again and again and again. Yes, he was very much involved with the feet, and these are again more adverts. I mean, the previous one you can see has the I. Miller text, and very much shows that kind of blotted line technique that we've been talking about. But yes, he literally made his fortune on ladies' shoes.
Now, this style of shoe, was that popular at this time, or had it been in fashion for? I have no idea. But
I don't really know. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with ladies' shoes fashion.
Some of these shoes look like they could be for very fat women. That one down the bottom.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're also they're also kind of again. There's a slightly whimsical air to Warhol's work, certainly his commercial work. If you go to the next the gold shoe,
why isn't it? Give me a second. I don't know why it's doing this.
I think Mr. Warhol is just cursing us, isn't he?
Right, let's try again. You should be able to see it again.
Yep. Number 15 is where I am. There you go.
Here we go.
The gold shoe. Yes. And anyone familiar? I mentioned that Warhol grew up in an Orthodox Rite Catholic family, and I would say that the kind of interest in the icon, I mean, literally the religious icon, the specific style with gold and color and embellishment and kind of flatness, and I think was all very influential. I think that as a child, every week facing the iconostasis in the church, which is the screen between the nave and the sanctuary, which would have been decorated with dozens and dozens of paintings of saints and literal religious icons. I think you can see threads of that in his work, even in his early commercial work. So yeah, and this is another shoe. He actually, as sort of promotional items, he produced some little self-published books, which were done with offset, lithographs with drawings by him, sometimes text written by other people. This shoe has there's a little like kind of poem under it. And lead a shoe to water, but can't make it drink. And I think this is from a book called À la recherche de choux perdus.
Almost a Pharaoh quality line there.
Ooh. Yeah. So these were kind of from little books that he produced as promotional material for his his commercial work. Yeah, and there's a kind of if you go to the next one, number 19, there's a very twee sort of precious quality to a lot of his early work. I mean, it's very much kind of has this kind of, you know what I mean, that slightly cute kind of thing going on, but it was very distinctive. This was a little
bit kitschy, Dio.
A little kitschy, yes, and I think quite self-consciously so. This cat was from actually a book called. Now I'm not going to remember how many cats it was. I think it was like 25 cats called Sam and one blue pussy, I think was the name of this book. And it was just basically, again, another one of these self-published offset books, hand-colored. He would sort of enlist his friends or, to sort of do hand coloring, very much like William Blake did, actually. William Blake's books were kind of printed with etching and then hand-colored with watercolors. But again, these promotional kind of materials. And this is another, again, the kind of blotted line drawings, bringing in the gold. And this, I would say, is the other very important aspect of Warhol's private work from this period. So we sort of seen the commercial work. These are kind of sort of private drawings. He did show these drawings. In fact, he actually sent some of his shoe drawings and some of his figure drawings to the Museum of Modern Art and received a very polite but very definitive letter of rejection from them, which I still exists. So he was sort of trying to show this work, and we're sort of approaching the end of the 1950s. He was trying to show this work in a kind of gallery situation. So I would say that this is certainly the beginning of his conception of himself apart from the commercial world, starting to think of himself as a kind of an artist producing sort of pieces for collection rather than as part of an advert.
Some of this style kind of reminds me of kind of early 80s new romantic stuff.
Well, and again, I mean, it's almost impossible to avoid his influence later. So I'm sure there may be a thing there. If you go on the next, these are those little books that I was talking about that he self-produced. Yeah, 25 cats named Sam and one blue pussy there. Holy Cats by Andy Warhol's mother. The other thing about these books, and something that we should that I should mention as an important biographical fact is that after he became successful and well off in New York, one day his mother showed up at his house in New York, in his townhouse, and said she was moving in. And she was probably a woman in a probably 60s at that time, mid 60s. All the children were grown. I mean, her husband was gone, and she apparently said that she'd come to kind of look after Andy because he was, unmarried, living alone in New York, and needed a woman to take care of him. But I think she also probably needed someone to kind of look after her at that point. And so she basically moved into, he owned a townhouse, a multi-story house, and she moved into kind of a suite on the ground floor, and lived her own kind of life there. I mean, she did sort of take care of him. She cooked for him every day, made lunch for him every day, which was apparently a sandwich and a bowl of Campbell's tomato soup. She also connected quite quickly with the Czech-speaking community. Again, being New York, there were, basically little enclaves of. I think I'm all alone again. There were enclaves of different ethnicities. So if you were an Italian, you could go to Little Italy and connect with all the Italians, or go to Brooklyn. If you were, Chinese, you could go to Chinatown, and there very much was a kind of Slavic, various Slavic communities. There's a Polish community, there was a Czech community, and so Mrs. Warhol, Julia Warhol was his mother's name. Again, very quickly sort of established her own life as this sort of widowed immigrant mother living in New York. And the reason I'm mentioning her here is because all these early works, if you see that very distinctive cursive script, that is his mother's writing. And so even in some of his commercial work, even in his sort of shoe adverts, he would have his mother do the text. I mean, she had this very distinctive style of writing, and so you will see that in many of these early pieces, Mrs. Warhol's writing. She would, of course, as a non-native English speaker, she would also make mistakes occasionally when she was transcribing things, and he would leave them in very consciously. Leaving mistakes in. So, yeah, this is a page from one of the books. This is a kind of a surrealist cookbook on the subject of cookbooks. Maybe not necessarily a right-wing cookbook, but yes, he along with a interior designer called Susie Frankfurt made this sort of absurdist cookbook with sort of these ridiculous illustrations.
Trader Vic's cropping up again there, D. So,
yes,
mentioned in a Warren Zevon song, I seem to remember. Werewolves of London, they mentioned a Trader Vic's.
Yeah, Trader Vic's. Although I didn't know that they had a branch in New York. I thought it was a kind of West Coast thing. But Trader Vic's, I always associate with kind of tiki culture, because I think that they were kind of instrumental in starting that in the 1950s. Yeah, see the car there. And again, you see it signed Andy Warhol. That's actually his mother. So he had his mother do a signature for him. So if you want to move on, this is some very private work. And
what is this?
Well, you just
D. Hello.
Yeah, sorry. There's some sort of sirens outside. Yeah. So this is another kind of abiding interest. I mean, he did lots and lots of private figural drawings, mostly of young men, and these works kind of came to light, sort of later on. when there was more interest in kind of his early career.
Oh, what? Ban this filth. What is this?
I think these are absolutely beautiful drawings.
Oh dear, oh dear.
Let me go on.
Yes. Okay.
But you can see that he was a really fluid and amazing draftsman. Humorously enough, you wanna keep going.
So these are
Yeah,
some shells. Yeah.
the shells and feet, and again, the feet are an abiding interest with Mr. Warhol. These are all drawn with like a ballpoint pen as well. I mean, he also had a very kind of vernacular sense, and so as kind of slightly kitschy and precious as these works are, they're also quite unpretentious. I mean, literally, that was his preferred drawing medium because he didn't have to. It wasn't like the blotted things where it was a kind of a labor, a kind of a punctuated labor. You could draw very fluidly and not have to think about recharging your pen or brush.
Oh dear, oh dear. Okay.
And again, the gold and yes, but these are quite representative of I would say the early part of his career, both the commercial work and the private work.
So, okay, and is that a man? I'm presumably that's a woman this time now, right?
No, it's a man. No.
Oh, right. Okay.
I don't think there's any intimate drawings of women. No. So we arrive at a kind of a turning point here. This is a passport photograph that was among Mr. Warhol's effects when he died, and you can see that he's made some alterations to it. One of the things that troubled him, well, the two things about his appearance that troubled him was that he was losing his hair, and also he hated his nose. I mean, he had a very prominent, slightly bulbous sort of nose.
Yeah.
And again, these two things were quite distressing to him, and he was very shy and quite self-conscious about this. And so you can see here that he's literally sort of used a pencil and made some alterations. Well, he actually had these alterations done, and so of course by this time, which would be in the late 1950s, maybe the very early 1960s, maybe 1960, he was quite well off, and so he had cosmetic surgery to reduce the size of his nose, and he also at this time began wearing wigs. And he had a kind of interesting philosophy about the wigs, which was that if you're going to wear a wig, you might as well make it obvious that you're wearing a wig. So there was never an attempt to kind of have a natural looking kind of head of hair. It wasn't the way that a man would get a sort of toupee or something and try to disguise the fact. He actually sort of, it was at once a way to kind of cover up and conceal the fact that he'd lost his hair, but also to make it quite obvious. And it is an interesting strategy of kind of shielding and defense, but done out in the open, that we will see, I think, crop up again and again in both his life and his work. So if you move on, there's Andy and Mum, and as I said, she cooked for him and made sure he ate and
Got his vitamin D. Got his vitamin D.
Got his vitamin D. Yes, vitamin D milk there. And she also spent a lot of time, trying to potentially sort of fix him up so that he could get married, so that she didn't have to worry about him anymore. And so, at the sort of turn of into 1960, it's really a kind of turn in a lot of ways. I mean, he was had this very successful career in advertising and commercial art. He was already quite well known within those circles. I mean, he was financially well off, and he sort of decided to kind of change the direction of his career. And I think that this is really the point where we could start to think about the Andy Warhol that people know sort of was created, and the familiar look that people would associate with him, and also the turn from kind of commercial art to fine art happened at this time as well. Now I want to talk about a little bit about what was happening in the world of painting, in the world of fine arts, because again, Warhol was absolutely unashamed about the fact that he had made his start as an ad man, as an illustrator, and this was very unusual at the time. I mean, I think that certainly in America there had always been a kind of self-conscious desire to adopt the kind of ways of the European art world, and certainly the ways of the European modernist avant-garde. And so it was not the done thing to go from being a well-known commercial artist and just jump into the world of painting, the world of fine art like this. So at the end of the 50s, I would say New York, the world of New York painting was really dominated by what's called abstract expressionism. And this is a painting by Jackson Pollock, which I think people are probably familiar with Pollock in his work. AA, are you?
Yes, and I would say that this would be held up as a banner by the likes of PJW as an example of modern art being trash. Usually, Pollock is one of the first go-to examples because it's like, oh,
yes,
I can do this, Yeah.
Yes, and I mean, and even at the time, of course, Pollock was. Now, I want to point something out here. People that aren't familiar with me, and my sort of philosophy about art. I don't care that people don't like this. I mean, what you like is not of my concern. I mean, I like asparagus. I don't like, octopus. I like, lavender, but I don't like so and so. I mean, yes, we all have likes and dislikes. If you like it, that's fine. If you don't like it, that's fine. We're not here to talk about taste. We're not here to talk about, kind of what your opinion, especially the opinion of someone that's an outsider to this world. I mean, this was a world that, it was like any other kind of specialized area of human endeavor. It had its own logic, it had its own rules, it had its own kind of justifications, and it's fine. I don't expect someone who didn't come, who doesn't sort of, isn't immersed in art, isn't sort of interested in the kind of discourses that took place in the world of art, whether we're talking about the Renaissance or we're talking about Cubism. I wouldn't expect someone to kind of have the vocabulary or the inclination to kind of talk about or appreciate or understand this. So, I just want to sort of clear up the fact I'm not trying to persuade people. I'm not trying to persuade people about Warhol or anything else. I'm just here to kind of talk about him if you're interested in the various discourses around this stuff. And I think we did that modern art stream many moons ago on the Deepest Law AA. This was something that that came up as well. The idea that
yes, indeed, yeah.
I'm just not. It just isn't my concern. Yeah, okay, you hate it. You think it doesn't have talent. All right, fine. Then shut up. Stay away from it. You don't have to engage with it. It's very odd to me, this idea that people have that art should be accessible to them. Well, why? I mean, do you think everything in life should be accessible to you? No. I mean, you can
in a
find
way,
things that you like.
I hate to make this analogy, but it could be an analogy that some people will get. It's a little bit like gaming journalists complaining that Dark Souls is inaccessible to unskilled gamers or something like that.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. I mean, yes. I mean, obviously, if you're interested in engaging with, the ideas put forth, then do so. If you're not, then don't. But I'm coming from the position of someone who is interested in the ebb and flow of ideas and so that's what we're talking about. So yeah, I don't much care, for people's opinion of Pollock or Warhol or Leonardo da Vinci or anyone else. So just wanted to clear that up. But yes, you are absolutely right, AA, that Pollock would have been was a prime example. But as Picasso was, as certainly Henri Matisse was, that every artist, from a certain point of view and from a certain strata, there's always going to be someone that that is going to denigrate it and not be interested in the discourse, and that's fine. But this was certainly the New York art world at the time. This is Willem de Kooning. This painting and next painting, sort of earlier pieces of his. He had bodies of work that became much better known, sort of after this. We want to move on. This is Franz Klein, and these were all the kind of big name artists. And I would say that if you're not familiar with kind of abstract expressionism and what it was trying to do, these paintings are all very large in general. These are all kind of huge canvases, and there was very much at the time an idea that instead of kind of that you really were using painting to engage with the entirety of a surface. It was very much of the idea of, well, let's sort of take representation out of painting altogether. Let's stop thinking about painting as an illusion, as a window, as a picture into another world, and let's just think about it as paint on a surface. What can you get? What sort of designs can you get? What sort of ideas can you present with what is very self-consciously paint on a surface?
This is Rothko, right, D? This one we're looking at right now.
No, that is Barnett Newman. I didn't put Rothko in, but he would have been sort of a part of this, although again, many of these artists kind of had tendrils that moved in other directions. Don't go beyond the next painting there. There's a sort of last one. This is Philip Guston, but these were all quite big names at the time. I mean, I think another concern of course of art of this time was to activate the entire surface. So if you sort of think of Jackson Pollock, a traditional composition, you would have a kind of focal point. You would direct the eye in a certain way. There would be areas of greater interest and areas of less interest in the composition. I think there was very much in this work an attempt to kind of make the entire surface of the painting active and interesting. That there wasn't a sort of there wasn't a subject, there wasn't a focal point. And also attached to this, I mean, there was very much also the era of like people going to visit their analyst, and when you sort of read kind of mid-century New York things, there's this very big concern about kind of unpacking, your sort of inner world. And many of these painters, fairly or not, I think that a lot of this work kind of gets lumped into this a bit too much. But there was a sense also that these paintings were kind of trying to express the kind of angst of the modern man, you know, in the post-war world. And he was very much about the idea of the kind of heroic painter exploring, you know, the depths of his soul and psyche. You know, it was a very big, very serious, very kind of macho world. I mean, all these guys used to go to a pub called the Cedar Bar in downtown New York, and they would drink and they would get into fist fights and they would argue, and you know, I mean, it was a very particular kind of scene, and so this was the kind of dominant world of kind of New York painting in the late 1950s.
Interesting that you see it as a kind of masculine scene, psychoanalytical, but also like masculine, in a strange way, like
yeah,
it
is
painterly versions of Hemingway and his mates or whatever.
Yes, very much that same, and of course they, you know, many of these people kind of, you know, there was crossover from one world to the other. I want to find a little quote here. Flipping through one of the books, I realize I'm talking too much, so I'm gonna try to pick up the pace a bit. So this is actually from Warhol's sort of memoir of the 1960s, and he's talking to his friend Larry Rivers, who was an artist who kind of started in as a kind of abstract expressionist artist. I asked Larry about Jackson Pollock. Pollock, socially, he was a real jerk, Larry said. Very unpleasant to be around, very stupid. He was always at the Cedar on Tuesdays. That was the day he came into town to see his analyst. And he always got completely drunk, and he made a point of behaving badly to everyone. I knew him a little from the Hamptons. I used to play saxophone in the taverns out there, and he'd drop in occasionally. He was the kind of drunk who'd insist you play I Can't Give You Anything But Love, Baby, or some other songs that the musicians thought were way beneath them. So you'd have to see if you could play it in some way that you wouldn't be putting yourself down too much. He was a star painter, all right, but that's no reason to pretend he was a pleasant person. And, you know, Larry Rivers goes on to talk about how they would sort of have these fights. He could be really babyish, too. I remember he once went over to Milton Resnick and said, "You de Kooning imitator," and Resnick said, "Step outside." Really, Larry laughed. You have to have known these people to believe the things they'd fight over. The art world sure was different in those days. I tried to imagine myself, this is Warhol talking, I tried to imagine myself in a bar striding over to, say, Roy Lichtenstein and asking him to step outside because I'd heard he'd insulted my soup cans. I mean, how corny. I was glad those slug-it-out routines had been retired. They weren't my style, let alone my capability. So yeah, I mean, this was I just sort of included all this to kind of show the world that Warhol was entering into. So we want to go to the next slide. So this is a picture by an artist called Robert Rauschenberg, and beginning in the late 1950s, Rauschenberg and a few other artists sort of entered the New York art world scene. I mean, these were fairly young at the time, and they started doing these pieces that were kind of nominally engaging with the language of abstract expressionism. You know, the kind of expressive brushwork and the kind of, you know, all over kind of quality and the grand scale. I mean, this is a very large picture, but they were starting to kind of introduce elements that kind of wrecked a lot of the kind of, I would say that this attempt towards purity that you saw in some of the, you know, the kind of big name pure Abex guys. And so this thing, I mean, literally, there's an umbrella, there's a squashed umbrella, and there's an electric light, and there's like two reflectors from a bicycle or from a sign. There's newspapers, there's pieces of clothing, there's wallpaper, there's lace. This is sort of, in a way, kind of making a slight mockery of the kind of, as I said, the kind of sublime intentions of pure abstract expressionism. We want to go to the next one.
Representation is bursting out of the abstract here.
Yes, and that is very much the kind of thread that this generation of artists, including Warhol, would come out of. This is another Robert Rauschenberg called Bed, and I mean, literally, it is a pretend abstract expressionist painting, but it's also literally a bed complete with pillow and quilt and such. And so, suddenly the kind of purity and this sort of, again, complete rejection of figuration, complete rejection of representation. Also, this complete rejection of the kind of vernacular. As I said, Warhol was very much unashamed of his kind of commercial art beginnings, and I think that these artists also started to kind of bring in aspects of everyday life in a way that was sort of anathema to this serious, very European-minded kind of art world that had been. If you want to go to the next.
Would you say it's fair to say, Dee, that to understand these pieces that we're looking at now, you need to see them as they were some way against the abstract painter? All of these are like comments on the abstract painters.
Yes, and very self-consciously. I mean, and it was understood at the time that way. It was very clear what these guys were doing. This is another Rauschenberg. And I mean, it's again taking up. Picasso, of course, was very well known for producing sculptures using kind of found objects, but this sort of takes it to a kind of slightly absurd level. Putting these little bird wings, including the Coca-Cola bottles, as just a very blatant kind of appeal to the everyday reality of mundane American life. Yes.
I wonder if there's, in this, like introducing the Coke bottles and so on, a kind of undercutting of what some may have perceived as the pretension of the the kind of fun portentousness of the abstract artists, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is I would say a strain of kind of that you will see very much in Warhol's colleagues and him as well, and in these guys. Although again, I think Rauschenberg and other artists, these sort of transitional artists, they had a foot in both worlds. I think that the kind of comments and mockery, it was certainly there, but it was quite gentle. If you want to go to the next one, there's another Robert Rauschenberg. Again, it's sort of using the language of the expressive, the kind of explosive, the energetic brushstroke. But if you kind of look at it carefully, you can see that there's kind of images within it. There's like a rowboat, and there's an aeroplane, and there's other things. I mean, Rauschenberg produced these. There's Ingres odalisque there in the kind of middle at the bottom, and he produced these by taking printed like pictures, like newspaper prints or other kind of offset prints, and soaking them with a solvent, and then putting them on the paper or cloth and rubbing them vigorously. And so you can see there's these kind of scribble marks. I mean, that's sort of an artifact of what he was doing. And what will happen is that the solvent will soften the ink on the print, and it will transfer the ink to the surface. And so you can kind of make these rudimentary, kind of almost collage kind of pieces. And Rauschenberg's early work very much kind of played with this concept. But again, using
in the bottom left there, D, I can't make out if that's a scene on a rocky beach or some chaps playing rugby.
I think it is either rugby or American football. I think that's what that is. I mean, it's difficult to see unless you sort of really blow it up. But Rauschenberg did another one of his famous early series was he produced illustrations for Dante's Inferno, and they are all kind of produced in this way using basically images from newspaper transferred with solvent and sort of inks and lines, and they're quite sort of chaotic and beautiful and strange, but sort of playing with the idea that in a way you're kind of summoning ghosts. I mean, all these images are kind of ghosts of a print. They're ghosts of a photograph, and so that kind of evocation was very much on his mind, I think. Let me go on to the next one.
But once again, the representation coming through the abstract, bursting its way forth. Representation is back, baby.
Yes, and I would argue that representation never goes away. You cannot escape this fundamental human desire to connect with the real in one way or the other. These are two paintings by Rauschenberg. This is another kind of comment. It's called Factum 1 and Factum 2. And so literally he made basically two paintings that are identical but also not identical, which again is sort of antithetical to this idea. As a good abstract expressionist artist, you're going to sit down and you're going to pour your soul out, and it's going to come out through the paint. And it will be this kind of expression of that moment in time, that moment of inspiration. Well, here Rauschenberg is literally just making the same painting twice. And so, the question comes, of course, well, which one's the original, which one's the copy? Are they both original? Are they both copies? It's almost a kind of denial of this idea of the kind of sovereignty and uniqueness and sort of unitary sense of the image.
But also on another level, D, a massive attack on anybody with autism. You wouldn't be able to stand the asymmetry of the two.
Oh, okay. Pop on to the next one. This is another artist. I again, sort of associated with transitional figure. This is Jasper Johns, and again, sort of nominally playing with the language of expressionist painting. But, in this case, then there's this weird layer where he's kind of putting the color names in there. But of course, then they're kind of working against what you're actually seeing. The yellow is white, and the yellow is yellow, and the red is blue, and the blue is red, and it's kind of playing games with, I think, the visual and the language sense.
Once again, an assault on the artist's mind. Just imagine the artist like, not yellow, white.
Well, it's funny, we're gonna use that modern idea of artistry. I'd actually associate these artists with the kind of autistic impulse more than the abstract expressionists, in a way, because again, there's a kind of emotional distance with these pieces. I mean, you don't look at this painting and say, well, Jasper Johns was really expressing his feelings. Well, it's not clear what he was expressing. I mean, it seems expressive because it's messy, and we've come to learn that being messy means that you're expressing yourself, but what is it expressing, and why? And I think it's very much a kind of indictment of a lot of ideas that had grown up around sort of orthodox modernism, you know. And in a way, of course, people like PJW should love this stuff, because all of these artworks are really kind of hammering the kind the sort of notions of purity and sublimity that came out of the kind of abstract
Yeah, well, I mean,
impulse.
I'm getting. I mean, if I can make some imperfect analogies, I'm getting like this is like I don't know, like punk after prog or something kind of like
Yes.
you know. We're going to get back to like really basic representation after all of your wankery type thing. There's something about what they're doing here that's poking holes in the self-importance of the previous generation.
Yes.
So that's very recognizable to me. You see that quite a lot in different forms and different. Yeah.
You're right. And it certainly is an impulse that pops up in various different sort of worlds. You want to go into the next one? This is another Jasper Johns, and again, another staple of kind of high modernism is the idea of a monochromatic painting. Oh, this is a pure white painting. Well, it's a green painting, but I mean, if you look very carefully, it's also a target, and so. Yes, a target is a sort of geometric abstraction, but a target is also a real thing. I mean, we know what a target is. It's a symbol for an action. It is a place to aim. You use a target to help your visual system aim your arrow, or aim your bullet, or aim your thoughts in this case, towards the center of the thing. You're kind of looking for a bullseye, and so yeah, it's a strange kind of foot in both worlds. This
but it's representational, whether you want it, or because your mind registers that it's a target. But also, I've noticed that it seems to be painted on. It's very noisy here. I can't work under these conditions. The paint is obviously on newspaper, isn't it?
Yes, and Jasper Johns' work. We'll see this in the next few works. Yes, it's sort of it's partially a collage, and the newspaper, it's sort of bits of newspaper that will kind of act as a texture. This is also painted with a quite unusual medium called encaustic paint. And encaustic paint is basically, so if you have oil paint, what you have is a pigment mixed with linseed oil, which, that's the traditional oil paint. If you have acrylic paint, you have a pigment mixed with an acrylic polymer emulsion. Well, encaustic paint is a pigment mixed with beeswax. And the way you paint with encaustic is you actually heat it up. So you have a little tins with the paint in it, and you sit it on a heated surface, and the paint becomes liquid, and then you dip your brush in it, and you have a few seconds to make your stroke before the wax solidifies, and then you of course have to dip your brush in and melt the wax again and make the next stroke and the next stroke. So it's a very painstaking medium. It's also quite an ancient medium. So if you look at sort of like Etruscan wall paintings and such, many of those were done with encaustic paint, or mummy portraits, which is something that came out of the Roman Empire. I think the Coptic Christians did them as well. Those are also painted with encaustic. It's a very ancient, and it's also a very durable medium. And I think Jasper Johns kind of sort of really revived it and took it up because of its really visceral textural qualities. You can almost kind of see.
I find it quite interesting, as much as you may see certain people reeing about this in the chat. I've noticed a lot of people saying things like, "Oh, it reminds me of grass. It reminds me of a bowling green." And if you're thinking, well, maybe if the target of this is somebody like Rothko, nobody would say that about his. Like his is just a color, right? Whereas this, because of the techniques being used and the paint and the textures and so on is evocative of something. So it's representational, even though it's just green. Whereas Rothko's would just be green, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's fair. I mean, I also think, you know, that this is also very much it's an object. I mean, you think one thing that this painting has in common with the kind of impulse with some of the abstract expressionists is that this idea of making you aware of the paint on the surface. And I mean, even in my own work, this has always been a great concern. I mean, I'm very much a kind of materialist. I mean, one of the reasons I have such an affinity for the kind of world of the alchemist is this idea that the materials of art, the things that you make the work out of, are just as important as what you're trying to depict. You know, you know, ideally, I would like people to be aware of both what I'm painting and what I'm painting it with, and I think that's also quite apparent here. You can't get away from the kind of material reality of this paint, you know, and I think that's another reason perhaps that he chose to do encaustic paint and use it in this manner. But I think that's something that he would share with the abstract expressionists. But I think you really get it with this. I mean, it's something you maybe don't get so much with Rothko, whose surfaces, I mean, while the colors may be beautiful and his sort of the way he's able to kind of blend the colors is beautiful, but the surfaces are not particularly interesting compared to something like this. So I'm going to go into the next one. This is another Jasper Johns, and again, this is an abstract painting. You know, I mean, what is a flag? I mean, a flag itself is an abstraction. You know, it's a symbol. It's something whose kind of geometric forms and arrangements are meant to kind of signify something. It signifies power. It signifies sovereignty. It signifies whatever the ideals of the state for which your flag stands. And so, you know, he's also using that. I mean, also this painting becomes a kind of symbol, but a symbol for what? I mean, this is not a patriotic painting, you know, and I don't know if that comes across or not, but you know,
I just note there are 48 stars. I couldn't help but notice.
Yes, this was well, I'm trying to think of
Hawaii added later, or?
I don't know when the last state was added. This painting may have been made before that. This was quite early 1950s, so I don't know when the I don't know when the Alaska and Hawaii. Yeah, it probably hadn't become states yet. So if you go to the next one, this is a detail from this painting, so you can very much see the kind of texture of the paint and the kind of newspaper collage underneath it. And when you get very close to this painting, you can read and see all the things underneath the paint, because the paint's slightly translucent, slightly transparent in some cases.
A flag made out of yesterday's news, yesterday's fake news.
Yeah. And if you're interested in Jasper Johns, I mean, he's absolutely one of my favorite artists. He's still with us, amazingly enough. He's, I would say, out of all the artists we've looked at and talked about, he's the only one still living. So back to Mr. Warhol. So I think we had that big long diversion to kind of show you the world into which Andy Warhol had started to dip his toe as a fine artist. So he certainly knew Rauschenberg and Johns and people of their kind of, and Larry Rivers, who I read that excerpt from. These artists who'd started to kind of move in a different direction from the dominant kind of force in the New York art world at the time. And so Warhol's very first kind of, quote, fine art paintings were quite literally paintings of comic book characters. This is, of course, Dick Tracy. And it's kind of difficult to put ourselves in the shoes of someone at this time. I mean, we're so used to sort of seeing comic books in high and low culture. As we know, cinema and retail world is completely awash with endless iterations of comic book things. But at the time this painting was done, comic books were very much they were in their place. They were an entertainment for children, and that was it. And so just the audacity of kind of, well, I'm going to become a fine artist now. I was a very successful commercial artist. I'm going to become a fine artist. What am I going to paint? Well, I'm going to paint comic books, and again, it's difficult, I think, for us looking back to see what a strange step that was. There is no
something from the lower strata of culture into like the quote unquote high art world, something like this.
Yes, I mean, although I don't, I don't know how much of a conscious effort that, sort of a conscious idea that was. I mean, the other thing, of course, is there's no sense that he's sort of expressing himself here. There's no sense that this is a kind of window onto his soul or kind of serious sort of grappling with, existential problems or something. I mean, although, I mean, you can see that even in this, he is sort of, again, like we saw with Johns and Reichenberg, is sort of aping the stylistic tendencies of abstract expressionism with the the sort of messiness and the brushstrokes and the drips and all that. But again, I mean, this is very much a kind of depersonalized.
One thing I will mention, though, Dee, of all the pieces you've shown us, this is the only like man's face. All of the others weren't really showing people. So this is the first actual person we're looking at.
Yes, and this would have also been slightly unusual at the time. And of course, when we say art world, I mean, there's never been just one art world. There's many different art worlds. There's many different sort of, again, specialty art worlds for every sort of taste. I mean, there was certainly figurative artists painting all during the period of the abstract expression, painting all during the period of Cubism, all during the period of Impressionism. There were older traditions, other traditions that people are more familiar with, going on at the same time. I'm just, as a shorthand, I'm referring to, quote, the art world as the kind of, I would say, the kind of milieu of work that would have been written about by the New York Times or something.
What was on vogue? What was in fashion?
Yes, the vogue, the tastes of the ruling class of the day. So yeah, you want to go to next? This is another very early Warhol piece, and good old Superman. But again, it's got a foot in. It's still got a foot in the kind of gestural abstraction, sort of gestural. I mean, you get the scribbles and the drips. It's at once this completely flat, blank, low culture subject, but it's still sort of speaking the language of high art in a completely disingenuous way. Going to the next. Another Dick Tracy painting using the same source as the last. Again, Warhol's like he's also very, very intentionally making it arty. I mean, that was a very subconscious decision. It's art, so it has to look like art. And what does art look like? Well, it drips and it's messy.
Yeah, he's removed Popeye from just left the silhouette of Popeye.
Yeah, and we have a little bit of a crossword, there in the background. Again, sort of layering images. So It's not even, it's kind of disintegrate. The subject is at once brought forward and also kind of disintegrating at the same time. Now, these were Warhol's like earliest forays into kind of fine art and painting, were these comic book things. Very quickly, through mutual friends, he learned about another artist called Roy Lichtenstein. So if you go to the next slide. So this is a very early Roy Lichtenstein. In fact, this was Roy's first foray into what would become known as pop art. And these various artists who became associated with this movement, they learned of each other later. So like Warhol, when he was doing these comic book things, didn't know about Roy Lichtenstein. Roy Lichtenstein didn't know about Warhol doing this. Rosenquist and Oldenburg and all of these chaps. It's almost like this kind of simultaneously arose in various people unconnected to each other at the time in response to the conditions of the world. And I think that's something that you see often in science and art and everything else. You often, it's almost like these ideas come out of the ether, manifested in certain artists who have their finger in the wind, so to speak.
Well, one slightly off topic there. I'm wondering if there was any IP issue with this. Like, did Disney write a letter and say?
Well, that is something that will come up. At the time, no one cared. I mean, Disney is not going to have any idea that this is going on. I mean, again, remember, we're still in the kind of small world of of the past, where things are quite insular. It's not mass culture. This painting didn't go out on Instagram. No one saw these things, and of course, everyone hated them at the time. I mean, people have no idea how mocked and laughed at and despised these artists were at the very beginning by the serious art world.
This is
another Roy Lichtenstein. Yeah. As soon as Warhol became aware of Lichtenstein, he gave up the comic books because he said he just thought it was absolutely obvious that Roy was doing it and doing it better and doing it in a more kind of pure and less manneristic way. And so he immediately decided to go in a different direction when he saw these pieces, and I think it was probably a good decision. Although I like Warhol's, but I like the comic book things. But
I do like the Roy Lichtenstein ones. I've seen some of the real ones, in the Tate Modern that are there.
Yeah. And the next is also Roy.
And this one?
This is James Rosenquist, who was another artist who'd come out of the commercial world. So Rosenquist actually was a billboard painter. He was a sign painter. And so back in this time, when you had a big, one of those huge adverts, they were almost always painted by hand. Through basically a process of enlarging using a grid, which is an ancient system. I mean, the Renaissance artists did this. So when you would have you wanted a giant sign or billboard in Times Square or something, you would do the design, and then you would have these billboard painters literally go on the scaffold and paint the billboard by hand. And it's a very specific skill set. And it requires again, thinking about images on an absolutely huge scale, because of course you're painting things that are, 50 feet tall. So you have to think about kind of images and painting on a very different scale than the kind of, a discrete canvas on the easel. And so Rosenquist sort of, again, like Warhol and like Lichtenstein, took this vernacular, which he was quite literally employed as a job doing, and brought it into painting. Well, if I'm going to paint, why don't I bring this vastness and this type, this cold, dry style and this subject, here, like, spaghetti and a sort of a romance and the automobile. I mean, why don't I take these images that I'm painting every day out in Times Square and try to do something interesting with them on a canvas?
Can I just ask, is her nose melting?
No, I think she's pressing it against the ear of her lover, who's pressing his ear
I see that.
against
Yes, that's a man. I can see that now. It's a man's ear, not melted
yeah.
nose. I see. Okay, that makes sense. Got it. Okay, but presumably in real life, this thing is massive that we're looking at right
yes,
here.
this is a very large painting, and most of the paintings that we're looking at are quite large. This one fell out of order, but it's fine here. This is Klaus Oldenburg, who was an artist who kind of approached this pop art from the vein of sculpture. But again, it's very much using the same sort of ideas that we're talking about. In this case, food, and he was sort of famous at the beginning of his career for kind of making this.
I'm sure I've come across things like this in like tourist trap restaurants. When they put like like a kind of. You ever gone to one of those restaurants where they put like a model of a burger in the front?
Yeah, that's also a big thing. That's a big thing in Japan too. In fact, it's a high art. I've seen absolutely amazing fake food displays come out of Japan. But yeah, this is 2 cheeseburgers, but I mean, they're very much like expressionist cheeseburgers. Oldenburg should probably be well known to people. If you've ever been anywhere where there's like a giant paper clip or a huge like lipstick or whatever, like a big spoon with a cherry on it, those massive kind of sculptures are generally Klaus Oldenburg, and pretty much every big city has one somewhere. So he became sort of associated with these monumental sculptures later in his career. But and this was the one that was sort of out of order. This is another Rosenquist, the billboard painter. The subject in this case being Marilyn Monroe.
And this one?
This is Warhol again. So after Warhol kind of decided to quit the comics, he then sort of turned to advertising. And again, literally an ad man, literally commercial illustrator turning to advertising as a fine art, and also in Warhol's case, I mean, you'll notice it's the kind of lowest sort of advertising. I mean, these would be the sort of just completely ephemeral, we're having a sale on TVs, kind of illustrations, and again, applying the language of artiness to them, and making paintings out of them. The next one is another in this group of work. Again, this disjointed pieces of again the lowest sort of advertising.
But in a strange way, this is the stuff of everyday life, or the kind of the essence of American material culture, or something like this.
Yeah. And I mean, this would have been something an experience that you would certainly never have. I mean, you would, at this point, you wouldn't go to a museum and expect to see, if you were some sort of person from Brooklyn, or Ohio, or wherever, that sort of had a normal kind of middle class life, you wouldn't expect to see a power drill. You wouldn't expect to see, Dick Tracy. You wouldn't expect to see the kind of living vernacular world that you saw every day kind of reflected in art. And it's funny because, people say, well, people are kind of shocked by this, but I mean, that was what art, certainly certain strains of art always did. If you look at like a still life from the 17th century, it's the world of the class of people who
The Dutch
commission those
masters,
paintings. Yes, the Dutch masters. They're wearing the contemporary clothes. They're wearing the fashions of the time. That was the world of the people reflected in those in that art. And so this was just a sort of doing the same thing, but yet it still was quite sort of shocking when it first came about. Next one as well. I mean, water heat. I mean, who the hell ever thinks about the beauty of a water heater? No one. Let alone an advert for a water heater on sale. This is not the stuff of fine art.
Yeah, I like it. I've always liked this sort of thing, just because I'm a sucker. I love Americana, and you see, I guess one of the things that I don't know if he was consciously thinking about this, but how quickly would something like this become a period piece as well? So, like, to them, it would have been contemporary, but to us now, this is clearly like a 19 kind of early 60s water heater,
Yeah, and that's and of course, I like the redolence of a time past. I mean, but that would not have been these would have been right out of the world at the time. They wouldn't have acquired that patina of age. And I think that happens with lots of culture. I think it happens with music as well. Music also kind of acquires the sense of its time, and so it becomes something different. It becomes evocative of its moment, in addition to whatever other qualities it had.
Now what's this?
This is called Before and After, and again back to Mr. Warhol's sort of obsession with his own face and sort of reconstructing or constructing his own identity. I mentioned the nose job he had when he came, when he sort of had the means to do so, and so I mean this is just a giant painting. Again, is a very large picture, of the lowest sort of advert imaginable. You're a woman with a terrible nose. You could have a nice nose.
Those people in the chat, I can't see the chat, but I know what they're doing. That's a canard of the worst sort. You cut it out, chat. Okay,
yeah, I know what they're doing as well.
I can't see them, but I know what they're up to. And if they're not, I'm surprised. I'm pleasantly surprised, but I bet you they are. All right, shall we carry on?
Yeah, I'm not watching the chat, but I can imagine. So where did Warhol show these paintings? Well, the first time these paintings that these paintings were shown, and you can see them there, the Superman and others that we've seen, and others from this period, were first displayed publicly as backdrop for a window display at a shop called Bonwit Teller. So I can't remember who did.
Can you imagine how cool that would have been at that time? That's just like a department store, right?
Yeah.
I would have been.
Oh yeah,
cool.
And actually there was a tradition, and still is, I think, for kind of very creative window displays. In fact, Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, who we looked at earlier, they actually made a living. I mean, they sort of fed themselves by doing designing window displays for these same sorts of department stores in New York. Although again, they were slightly of an older fashioned bent, and so they didn't do it under their own name. They actually did it under an assumed name, whereas Warhol, as I said, was quite openly.
I mean, this is still quite commercial, I would have thought. You've been saying like a step into quote unquote high art, but this is a quite commercial setting for them.
Well, that's what's sort of amusing about it, is that basically the first time that these paintings were shown, even though that these were Warhol's step into fine art, they were still shown in this kind of commercial way, literally as decoration for a, for a window display of ladies fashion. So, but it also speaks to the fact that at this time, the early incarnations of this art, none of the commercial galleries wanted to take a chance with it. I mean, they really didn't know what to think of these artists at the time. So you showed it where you could. So yes, Warhol's one of his first official shows was as a window decoration. All right, so this painting, actually, I'm going to read a little another excerpt from Warhol's account of the 1960s. So he was doing these paintings, but as I just mentioned, he was not sure where to go. Not sure, people, the response to them was kind of bewilderment. He had a friend called Emile de Antonio, who was I think some sort of a left-wing filmmaker. I believe Emile de Antonio actually bought the rights to the entire film archive of the McCarthy hearings from, I think, NBC or CBS, one of the networks that had them, to use in a documentary. And his estate may still control those rights. I'm not sure, but
I hope he gives them up the damn commie. Carry on.
He was also a friend of Warhol, and was also very interested in kind of the kind of younger artists and this sort of new work that was cropping up. And Warhol, really kind of trusted him and trusted his opinion. I mean, Warhol, as we'll see, was I would say a slightly uncertain, slightly kind of passive character, and that comes up in many different ways. But it was very much like him to kind of, whereas another artist would say, well, my work is my work and I'm confident about it. Warhol had no compunction to just say, well, what should I be doing? So I'm going to read this here. At 5 o'clock one particular afternoon, the doorbell rang and D came in. And that's not D as in me. That's Emile de Antonio. They called him D. D came in and sat down. I poured a scotch for us, and then I went over to where 2 paintings I had done, each about 6 foot high and 3 foot wide, were propped, facing the wall. I turned them around and placed them side by side against the wall, and then I backed away to take a look at them myself. One was a Coke bottle with abstract expressionist hash marks halfway up the side. The second one was just a stark, outlined Coke bottle in black and white. I didn't say a thing to D. I didn't have to. He knew what I wanted to know. Well, look, Andy, he said after staring at them for a couple of minutes. One of these is a piece of shit. Simply a little bit of everything. The other is remarkable. It's our society. It's who we are. It's absolutely beautiful and naked. And you ought to destroy the first one and show the other. That afternoon was an important one for me. I can't even count the number of people after that day who, when they saw my paintings, burst out laughing, but D never thought pop art was a joke. As he was leaving, he looked down at my feet and said, when the hell are you going to get yourself a new pair of shoes? You've been wearing those that way all over town for a year. They're crummy and creepy, and your toes are sticking out. I enjoyed D's honesty a lot, but I didn't get the new shoes. It'd take me too long to break this pair in. I took his advice about most other things, art included, though.
Wow. Okay.
These are the paintings that he's referring to in that anecdote. And this was, I think, a very decisive moment where Warhol kind of left behind the kind of perfunctory gestures towards artiness and just presented this imagery, as he said, sort of pure and naked and stark, And
I agree with D, by the way. I agree with D. I think the one on the left doesn't need those perfunctory gestures towards the artiness. I agree. The one on the right is stronger. Yeah.
Yeah, and but of course he didn't take his advice he didn't destroy the other one, but yes. So I don't want to get into the kind of vulgar world of the market here, but I will note that the painting on the right, which is called Coca-Cola 3, was sold at an auction, I think in 2014, to the Crystal Bridges Art Museum, which I think was founded by members of the Walton family, who was the founder of Walmart. So his heirs have created an art museum, I think in Arkansas, where Walmart is kind of headquartered. And they buy up a lot of American art, and they bought this painting for $57,285,000.
Wow.
So it is strange how things turned out, and I think Warhol, were he alive, would not even be able to believe that he sort of entered this stratosphere. But anyway, hence I do think that this work, and particularly this one, is a very, very important kind of turning point for American art. And and I'm also happy that a museum bought it, and you can go and look at it. But yeah, there it is.
I would say this does sum up much of American culture.
Yeah,
it's a very good representation of American culture in one image.
I mean, for good or ill. But I also will point out that it's not just commentary. I mean, Warhol genuinely also could appreciate the beauty of these things. I mean, he was a commercial artist. He was an illustrator. I mean, he certainly he was not a kind of snob about where beauty could lie. He would just as easily see beauty in the design of a Coca-Cola bottle or a typeface as he would a painting or a vase or anything else. He never discriminated the source of beauty, and the classic Coca-Cola bottle is an absolutely beautiful design.
And that book, The Philosophy of Andy Warhol, that you gave me to read, that came through kind of deep love of Americana, and not like kind of the old-fashioned America, but the commercial America, the kind of 20th century, mid-century America that we're looking at here, which I actually share with him. I've always appreciated this sort of thing as well. So,
as we'll come across in the next stream, Warhol actually loved both. I mean, he was also deeply traditional, and that's a side of him that we'll explore in the next stream. But yes, I mean, one thing that he certainly wasn't was a snob. I mean, he genuinely was a very sensitive and aesthetic person, and just appreciated beauty where it came. So there's another anecdote where he said he asked another person, and I quite a theme running throughout his career was him asking people what he should paint, what he should do next. And so he asked, I can't remember if it was a gallerist named Eleanor Ward, it may have been her. He asked her what he should paint, and she said, well, why don't you paint what you love the most? And so he started painting money. This is a very early one. This is a big drawing of the dollar bill, and if you skip on to the next one, this served as a kind of a model for this painting. This is a very large picture. Again, proceeding in the vein that we see from the Coke bottle. I mean, even though sort of gone is the kind of gesture towards expression there. The one thing I think is sort of amusing about this painting is that it's kind of unfinished, and I think deliberately was left that way. It echoes, in a way, there's a very famous portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, which is unfinished, and I wonder if this was a kind of a nod to that. But there's a very clever thing that Warhol's doing here. I mean, again, at once it's certainly a celebration of the kind of literal design of the U.S. currency, but it's also kind of, well, what is a painting? I mean, a painting certainly in the vulgar sense of a collector. I mean, it's money on the wall. I mean, I just talked about that Coke bottle painting being sold for $50 million. So in this case, it's literally money on the wall. It's a painting of money, and it also becomes an investment. It's a status symbol. You're showing off your wealth by having an expensive painting. And what would your expensive painting be but money?
But do you think it's fair to say, Dee, that he wasn't? So one of my little bugbears back when I was marking students' essays and things like that is whenever any writer ever talked about commerciality, they always assumed it was like a kind of socialist critique, right? They always thought it's a critique about it. But with Warhol, this is not a condemnation of the commercial nature of art. It's a celebration of it, right?
Yep. And it's very good that you brought that up, because I think fitting with this idea that of course Warhol was not a snob, but his work was also decidedly its ambivalence is, I think, one of the most interesting qualities. Certainly one of the most interesting qualities about Warhol. If Warhol was anything, he was certainly not a political person. And so none of this work, I mean, what's sort of wonderful about it is that, it's so deadpan, and it's presented without any kind of comment or statement or kind of position of intent, that you can almost view it however you like. I mean, if you want to see it that way, as some sort of critique about commerce, commercialization, that's fine. But that was never in Warhol's kind of estimation of it. This would have been a good thing for him, the idea that art is money, and so all of these kind of tropes that we have of art commenting on things, sort of critiquing things. I mean, obviously, yes, there's bits and pieces of that, but you can't make those assumptions with Warhol. That there is no obviously loaded political statement in any of these things at all. And I will, by the end of these streams, make the kind of slightly bizarre assertion that Warhol was kind of a reactionary, and surrounded himself with people who were also quite reactionary in a certain regard. So again, I think that the truck thing to do is to say, well, Warhol was obviously a subversive and a degenerate, and in a certain way he was. But I think embedded within the way he handled his work and the philosophies or anti-philosophies that sort of came out of this work, there is a sort of deeply reactionary kind of fight against this sort of left-wing current of culture that comes out of these paintings. And I think that's also why the left has always been a little uncomfortable with Warhol and his implications. So yeah, very good shout, because I failed to mention that. So this is another painting with the money, and this is another huge development. So Warhol, all the work that we've seen up till now was sort of hand painted, in a kind of traditional way with a brush and a palette. But of course, as I mentioned back when we were looking at the blotted lines that he was doing, he very much had this sort of dream of sort of removing himself as much as possible. You know, this idea of being kind of hands off. And as you read in that philosophy book, he very often expresses this idea of being a machine, of literally becoming blank and invisible. And so I think because of this impulse, he had this desire: how can I make these paintings in a way that doesn't involve the expressive hand of the artist? How can I do these mechanically? And his first kind of foray into that was using rubber stamps, like literally having stamps made of his drawings, which then he could dip into the paint and stamp onto the canvas. And we'll see a couple of other works that were produced in that way. Another thing he did was to use stencils. And so he tried to sort of cutting out from a piece of card and then, daubing the paint or spraying the paint through the stencil. And then he, through, again, his connections in the commercial world of New York at the time, he knew about silkscreen printing. Are you familiar with that technology, how that's done?
No.
Well, so a silkscreen, you take an image, and it generally must either be a kind of pure high contrast, linear image, or halftone. In other words, you can get gradations through the little dots. So like if you ever look at like an old-fashioned like newspaper through a magnifying glass, you'll see that all the kind of lights and darks of the pictures are made up of little dots, and that's called a halftone. But so you get an image, whether it's a drawing or a photograph or whatever, and you have an acetate made of it. So you have that image printed on a clear piece of plastic. And then you take a wooden frame with a piece of what would originally been silk, but generally is a kind of synthetic fabric, very fine grained, even textured fabric stretched over a frame, and you paint on it a photosensitive emulsion, and you lay the acetate, you lay the plastic with the image on it, and you expose it to light, very much like you would do it with a traditional kind of photograph, developing on photographic paper. And then, you expose it, you then wash it out. So you sort of blast it with water. Sometimes you can use various solvents. And because you've used the photosensitive emulsion, the emulsion will kind of come off of the screen wherever there were black lines on the acetate, And so you're literally getting, it's very much like a stencil. You're literally getting a screen where all the areas that you don't want your print to go through are blocked up, and all the areas where you do want the ink to go through are kind of open. The fabric is open, and so when you press paint or ink against the screen, it will go through all the areas where the black lines were, where they covered up the photographic emulsion. I realize this is a little difficult to kind of describe. I have there's images later that will show the process. This is also how like t-shirts, like most t-shirts are made using the silkscreen process. It's a very common commercial way of producing an image. And so once you have this screen, you can print endless copies of whatever it is, whatever image you have.
Can I make an Austrian economics joke, D?
Sure.
I think Andy Warhol was making a comment on the nature of US fiat currency at this time. He was lamenting coming off the gold standard and the fact that money could just be printed endlessly. Well,
I mean, you joke. You joke, but I do wonder if that's embedded in there. I mean, actually, if you remember, like a couple of slides ago, that painting with the don't move on any further. That painting with the first painting of the dollar bill, that's actually a silver certificate, and it says on it there, and so that's actually, that painting of the dollar was back when the dollar was backed up by metal, which of course by Warhol's time was already a thing of the past. But yes, and so he moved on to the silkscreen process, and it allowed him to kind of produce hands-off paintings and reproduce them as many times as he wanted, and to manipulate images, and again in a very mechanical way. Yeah, and so you see the next one, and this is another kind of trope that comes through his work again and again and again, the idea of repetition. And I think that there's a kind of deep philosophical relationship with the condition of modernity, the condition of the mass media, the condition of kind of, as you say, the fiat currency, the magazine, the newspaper, that things become endlessly reproducible, in a world kind of divorced from the moorings of the spirit, divorced from the moorings of, the gold standard. Everything just becomes basically endlessly reproducible and endless and sort of ultimately hollowed out.
Yeah, like these dollar bills we're looking at here could just as easily be chocolate bars on a conveyor belt of a chocolate factory, couldn't they? Or anything else basically that's reproduced on a production line.
Yep. You go to the next one.
Yeah, or these. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is again quite a large picture, and there are others from this series, but yes, exploring this theme, the kind of the endless repetition, and again the fact that what is being repeated is itself a kind of abstraction, as you said, the fiat currency. It's valuable, and yet it's completely worthless. People will kill for it, and yet it's a piece of paper that by this point represented nothing real. It was all
here, of course, fragile, handled with care, and clearly this has not been handled with care. If that makes sense, like how can it be when it's endlessly reproduced like that? And he hasn't bothered to square off the edges there. So
this is one of the ones that was made with a rubber stamp. This was a period where he was really, again, experimenting with different ways to reproduce images, and he wasn't happy with these other techniques, with the stencils and the stamps and such, because he wanted to be able to reproduce them without the kind of quirks of the hand coming into it so much. We go to the next one. These are S&H green stamps, and I don't quite understand the concept of this. Apparently, you would receive these when you went to the supermarket, and you'd sort of save them up, and when you had enough of them, you could redeem them for, like, a lamp or a toilet brush, or, things like that. So in a way, these are also kind of a fiat currency, in the same way that the dollar was,
Now we get the famous Campbell soup coming in.
Yeah. So again, it's sort of like the age-old Andy Warhol question. Well, what should I paint next? Well, an old saw in the art world is, paint what you know. I think that's the advice given to writers to write about what you know.
Yeah, write what you know. Yeah, and incidentally, 18-year-olds don't know anything, so they end up writing like subpar fantasy usually. Anyway,
exactly right. And as I mentioned earlier, Warhol's mother, by his own admission, made him a can of Campbell's tomato soup, and a sandwich every day for lunch, And so, well, why not paint that? Embedded in that, of course, is ritual and repetition. It's something you have. It's something you have every day. It's at once a completely distant, impersonal, mass-produced object, tinned soup, but it's also, I think, redolent with these associations of him with his mother, and nourishment and his family, so it's kind of the perfect symbol, the sort of perfect subject for him at this time, because it's
the very American, the concept that you could package and commodify homeliness. The idea of like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's that weird American thing that you can sell the idea of the family home or the domesticity as a product, which was very 1950s, which it would have been when he was very of that period, of the post-war period, where they were trying to sell a lifestyle and sell an idea of the 2.4 family, which we've talked about before. And I think the Campbell soup is kind of part of that.
Yeah, and strangely enough, of course, soup is associated with. I mean, it's not a particularly. It's never in cuisine been. It's always been the kind of domain of the home cook. The soup is a peasant food. It's associated with the stew. I mean, it literally had quite humble origins. And so, of course, the idea of literally mass producing what was once the domain of the home cook, which was once a way to kind of make use of all the bits and bobs that were left over from other meals, that you make the soup out of it, to turn that into a tinned commodity. Again, it's these kind of competing and sort of oppositional impulses that I think really give this work its kind of strange resonance. You want to go to the next one there?
Oh, and there we go. Look, the Coca-Cola can and the Coca-Cola bottle and the Campbell soup.
Two of the symbols together. Also, I will say that again, back to Warhol's idea of impersonal and sort of removing the idea of the artist from the equation. These drawings were made. He took a photograph of these soup tins and bottles, like he took photographs of them, and then he projected them onto the paper, projected the photographs, and then just literally traced them. So it's a pencil drawing. It has, again, the kind of trappings of a very well-known artistic medium, but it's also a reproduction in a weird way. I mean, he was actually using himself as the machine, using himself as the kind of mechanism which copied something, something else, an image from somewhere else. This idea of pulling himself out of the process spiritually, and he was perfectly capable. I mean, as I said, he was a very talented draftsman. He was perfectly capable of producing drawings. I mean, this was very much a kind of aesthetic and sort of philosophical decision.
Now, of course, what's very clever, what we're looking at here is an American woman. Obviously, the Coca-Cola bottle is, a woman's body, and then the soup, as we said, represents that kind of domestic goddess side where she's making you the soup. So this, in a way, is the perfect 1950s housewife.
That's a very smart. It's a very smart take, and one that I certainly never thought of. But I get it. I mean, I was actually going to mention with the Coke bottle, when I was talking about the beauty of the Coke bottle, William Hogarth, the 18th century British artist, published a whole book about what he called the line of beauty, which was his idea that this kind of S curve, the kind of curve of the spine, was intimately connected with our idea of what is beautiful. And of course, that would very much be the idea of the curves of the female body, the curves of plants, the curves of various things in nature. And his idea was that you could actually kind of identify this same curve. And strangely enough, of course, the Coke bottle has that S curve as well. And of course, tied to your interpretation of it as literally a surrogate for the woman's body. Yeah, it's a very good shot.
So then we carry on.
Yeah.
And there's more of the Campbell soup. I mean, is it fair to say he gets a little bit obsessed with the Campbell soup?
He gets a little bit obsessed with everything. As you will notice, these are themes and variations. So if you go to the next one, so this is, I think, another very important moment. This idea of taking what he had kind of learned from his conversation with Emile D'Antonio, and just laying it out in the starkest, most unadorned manner possible. I take this Campbell soup, I'll remove the kind of graphite scribbles, I'll remove the artiness, and I will just make this naked and bare object. And again, these were kind of produced with semi-mechanical methods. These were where he was using stencils and sort of spray enamels and things like this to produce these pictures. So they were done by hand, but they were also done in a slightly impersonal kind of quasi-mechanical way.
Yeah, I actually prefer this to the drawings.
Yeah.
To the stencils. It's somehow more clinical. Also, I've just had the idea, D, that I might turn Ashes of Civilization into my own kind of Warhol. Like after we're done with the commentary, I might just release it again, like in a frame, and just like really endlessly release the same stuff over and over.
The same material, yeah. Well, they're kind of collage pieces anyway,
Yeah.
And
here we get a close up.
Yeah,
is that a different piece again now? Or?
Yeah, these are different. No, this is a different one. This is a larger one. And so there would be various sizes. I mean, also as we go on in his career, there's also very much this very anti-art idea that, well, if you want, it's very much a kind of an idea from commercial America. Well, do you want a small one or do you want a large one? Do you want a supersized one? Do you want one in this color or that color? It's almost like the kind of, there's kind of decorated choices. If you need a small soup can, we can do that. If you need a large soup can, we can also do that. So there will be various variations of these. Next. So he sort of toyed around with.
So I already like the autism of just like kind of, I used to watch. I know this is going to be a very strange reference, but I used to love Harry Hill's TV show. Right, if you watch one, it's not funny. Right.
Right.
Once you've watched like 6 in a row, and he's doing the same jokes in the same order, with a kind of like. And it starts getting like there's a humor to it. Like already now, this is like like the 7th Campbell soup, and I'm already starting to find it funny. But anyway, carry on.
It's gonna go on. It's gonna go on. Ready?
More soup, yeah.
More soup. This is a massive painting. This painting is like 8 feet tall. So.
What's fun about this is how far we're removed from like actual beef. It's like made with beef stock. Can you imagine how far from a cow the Campbell's vegetable soup is? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Next up.
Here we go. And they're all beef noodle. It's all the same soup as well.
Yeah, these are all beef noodle. But again, I mean,
but have you ever been to some of those like mega supermarkets in America? I mean, It is like they do stack them like that, and it's like it's almost overwhelming and sick in a way. Yep. But also like it can be overwhelming in a different way. I've told you before, like when I went to Rome and I went to those massive cathedrals in Rome, I felt like a little bit overawed. I also get that in massive American supermarkets because they stack them much higher than they stack them here. And again, you kind of, especially when I was, I think I was like 12 years old when I saw one of these. You look up and it's just kind of towering shelves of canned soup or whatever. It is kind of in its own shit way awe-inspiring as well.
Well, it's the postmodern sublime, I mean, it's the postmodern awe, from the inscrutable complexities of a medieval cathedral to, the Campbell soup can.
There's more soup. Yeah.
More soup.
He's got
so this one
ranges now. Yeah.
Yeah, well, so what this piece was, this was kind of I think the culmination of all these. This is called 32 soup cans. And what he did was he actually wrote a letter to the Campbell's Corporation, and he asked them for a list of all the soups that they produced. And they sent him a letter, and with a list of all the soups that they currently produced. And so he made a painting for each variety that were produced in 1962, I think. And so here they all are. These paintings were bought by an art dealer called Irving Bloom, and he fortunately kept them together. He kept this as one unit, and actually it's now, I think, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So
I'm extremely unhappy with one of the soups. The cheddar cheese soup.
Is it the cheddar cheese soup?
Cheddar cheese soup.
Oh, but look at the little label. Great as a sauce too.
Oh, but, I'm wondering what the lower seller was. It's got to be the cheddar cheese, isn't it? Pepper pot.
Well, strangely enough, I have looked into this, and they still make that variety. In fact, they still make most of these varieties.
That's one thing the Americans don't do well. Thanks. Is cheese. By which I mean, when it goes, like when they go down, they go really down, like the Easy's cheese in the bloody tube and stuff like that.
That's the aerosol.
Yeah.
American cheese.
American cheese, yeah. American cheese in a squeezy tube.
The cheese single, yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Oh,
so then,
yeah.
So then we turn. Again, Warhol turned to another idea. So, again, what were the other icons of the day? Of course, the soup, the money. Well, we had this whole sort of pre-existing pantheon of kind of deities, at the beginning of kind of modern mass media. And so the celebrity, of course, was obviously the next target. And so this was obviously Elvis Presley.
Sorry, Dio. I was going to say, just as we get into his kind of celebrity obsession, do you think it's fair to say again that this is never meant in a in a malicious way, or in a way that is saying, "Oh, isn't it awful? We live in such a shallow culture." I always take it as a kind of not glorification, but a kind of just reflection back on, this is what America is type thing, or even a celebration of it, rather than taking it as a constant down of that world. I think it's a building up of that world. No?
Absolutely. And remember, this is a lad who was bedridden for months as a child and passed his time by reading his mother's celebrity magazines. He was absolutely obsessed with the idea of celebrity and celebrity culture, and he loved these people. Just as the average kind of person did. Do
you think it's fair to say, though, as well? I don't know if this is a case of things looking better in the past, but I still think even now that the stars of the 50s had a glamour about them and had a genuine superstardom about them that is somewhat lacking in later periods, certainly lacking now. I can't think of a single star in the world who would be on the level of Elvis. Maybe Michael Jackson was the last one, but he died quite a while ago.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. And it certainly was also just a very iconic look. Hollywood was a very different place at this time. And also, these people were removed. I mean, you didn't like have their Instagram and Twitter, and your kind of liaisons with celebrities of this era. They were distant. They were kind of archetypal in a way that we certainly don't get now.
But what I mean, I'll give you an example, right? Mrs. AA the other day went to the dentist, and she had to have her she had to have that numbing thing put on. So when she came back, her mouth was like stuck in that certain shape. And obviously, my first comment was, "Well, it looked like Elvis." And she started doing an Elvis impression. The fact of the matter is that the stars of that time were so distinctive and so unique. They're even cultural touchstones now. Whereas I can't think of anyone who's that level of distinctive, as an Elvis or some of the other ones like a Marilyn Monroe or any of the other kind of icons of this era. I don't know why that is, but it just seems to be the case. So yeah. Should we carry on?
Yep, go on.
More Elvises.
Of course. In fact, he produced a whole body of work. So I had a slide which seems to have gone missing, but so before up to sort of the Campbell Soup time, he was doing these paintings in his house, in a room in his house, and very quickly as his career progressed, he's realized it was not viable. It was certainly not viable to do the paintings of the size he was doing and the scale he was doing. And he was starting to have shows in commercial galleries. The Campbell Soup tins and the Elvis paintings were his first commercial shows. Ironically, in Los Angeles, he couldn't get a New York gallery to show him, but a gallery called the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles gave him exhibitions of these paintings. So he had to find new digs. He eventually settled in an abandoned firehouse in New York, which was and again, this is a time where there could be such a thing. I mean, now you never find kind of fallow real estate of that type in New York, but at this time, you could just sort of, if you needed space, I mean, you could certainly find it. And so he rented this space from the person who apparently had leased the space for like $1 a year from the city of New York. It was a wreck, this place. So this was his first kind of official studio. He stayed there not very long because literally the place was collapsing in on itself. The roof leaked, the floors were unstable and unsafe, but all these early works were kind of produced there. So I did have a slide of a picture of all these Elvis paintings, literally like lying on the floor covered in plastic with giant puddles of water that had leaked in from the ceiling the night before. But he'd also hired an assistant. So he hired a chap called Gerard Malanga to help him produce these things, because of course these are quite an undertaking. These paintings are like life size, and to do the silk screening of this large really required help. So and Gerard Malanga worked for him for kind of the core period of his work in the 1960s. Gerard Malanga is still around. He was quite young at the time. He was a poet and a university student.
Just two very quick questions, Dee. You mentioned this got shown in LA.
Yeah.
What was the status of LA vis-a-vis New York in the art world at that time?
Well, very different. I mean, of course, LA was a much smaller kind of art scene at the time. Of course, there was a lot of money there. Hollywood money had certainly built up there, and there were also a lot of other money from petroleum and such things. So there certainly was a commercial art scene, but it was much kind of smaller than the New York art world. I mean, it's in America at that time. New York was the epicenter of American art. But so in a way, I think maybe the LA dealers were more willing to take a chance on this.
The other question I had was Elvis aware of this? And again, like these days, you think, oh well, would he be upset about copyright infringement? Or if he was aware of it, was it like, oh well, this is going to boost my legend and fame type thing? Like, does anybody know if he was aware of this series of works?
I looked into that actually, and I have found no evidence that Elvis ever acknowledged or knew about these paintings at all. I mean, certainly when these were produced, I mean, Warhol was, the art world was a very small place, and it was a very insular place, just as it sort of is in a way even now. I mean, people that aren't involved in the vicissitudes of various art scenes, they're not really going to be aware of most of the kind of figures and characters.
And he, of course, moved in a very different type of circles, and he wasn't he was a southerner, and I think he went to Vegas later on, didn't he? But I think Elvis always was like a southern, like he always stayed on south type thing. So maybe he wouldn't have gone up there for any reason at all, So interesting.
Yeah. So, but I've never found evidence that Elvis was aware. Now, of course, Warhol, other subjects that Warhol took up, it's a different story. But in the case of Elvis, no.
But he was the first one that he did this with, right?
He was one of the first ones. There were a few others. There was like Troy Donahue, who I don't know too much about, and there was like Tuesday Weld. I mean, these sort of like, people who were sort of very big teenage stars at the time, but I don't think have kind of aged. The knowledge of their celebrity didn't really kind of translate to to our day as much.
Yeah, you see, the reason I'm lingering on these 50s icons is that I'm not sure if young people can comprehend the level of fame that some of these people had, or the level of kind of legendary status that somebody like Elvis would have had even by the 60s, because there's nothing comparable now. Like, honestly, the only comparable thing we've seen in the past decade has been Donald Trump, to be honest, who was absolutely everywhere, Do you know what I mean? And even then, like, half the people hated Donald Trump. There is nothing comparable to this anymore, this kind of level of fame. So
no. And it again, like, as so much of this, you really have to kind of put yourself into the situation of the world at this time to kind of get a sense of what these things meant, and there was nothing else like this. Now. What?
I said Elvis was a man after my own heart. He loved a burger.
Yeah, and some other things that maybe weren't so good for him. All right, go on. More Elvis. I mean, there's a whole group of these. And the next slide. This is the exhibition at the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles. Yes,
I see. This bit here reminds me of that scene in The Man with the Golden Gun when Bond gets to Scaramanga's lair, and there are all those, those kind of cowboys standing there, because it looks like it could be a shootout,
Yeah.
So, and here's Brando.
I think people should, go back to the Elvises for a second. I think people should also note the fact that there's also a kind of menace here. I mean, because we're literally looking at doppelgangers. We're looking at these canvases with 2 and 3 and in 8. In fact, the one that you see on the right there, that's got 8 of them on one canvas, and they're pointing a gun at you. I mean, literally, he's pointing a pistol at the viewer. And so I think another kind of aspect of Warhol's work is there is an edge of menace to some of these things, which I think comes on even stronger later on, as we get on. But the gun would have a very important place in Warhol's work and life.
And again, in terms of the subject matter, another thing that people forget, even older people our age and older, I think it's difficult to appreciate how scandalous Elvis was. Maybe not by this time, but just a few years earlier, completely scandalous to most Americans. With his snaky hips and his sexual lyrics, and the girls throw knickers at him and so on and so forth. I mean, this was a new type of sensation. So it was a kind of assault in a way. I mentioned that because the same is true of this film, the Wild One, right? That was scandalizing to Americans in that era as well.
Yep. Just one little, before we move on, one little back dip into the vulgar world of commercialism. That the first Elvis painting we saw, called Double Elvis. In fact, I have data for two of those. The Double Elvis, one of those paintings sold at auction about 5 or 6 years ago for $53 million. The Triple Elvis one of those sold at auction for $81,925,000.
Oh, shit.
And there is also rumor that the 8 Elvis, the painting with 8 of them on one, was sold privately to someone in the Middle East for over $100 million. So again, this work is, the market on this work is unimaginable. I mean, these are now some of the most expensive, sort of works of contemporary art on the secondary
market. Can
market.
you imagine walking into your sitting room and having that looking at you? I mean, or even having a sitting room big enough to fit that in there. But presumably that Middle Eastern collector has got it in his house.
Presumably, I'm gonna take one little short diversion and read you an anecdote that you will certainly appreciate. I've got to just hang on a second. So this is again from his account of the 1960s. He's talking about one Robert Zimmerman, aka Bob Dylan, who we'll come upon later on in Warhol circles. I like Dylan, the way he created a brilliant new style. He didn't spend his career doing homage to the past. He had to do things his own way, and that was just what I respected. I even gave him one of my silver Elvis paintings in the days when he was first around. Later on, though, I got paranoid when I heard rumors that he'd used the Elvis painting as a dartboard up in the country. When I asked why would he do that, I'd invariably get hearsay answers like, "I hear he feels you destroyed Edie," or "Listen to Like a Rolling Stone. I think you're the diplomat on the chrome horse, man." I didn't know exactly what they meant by that. I never listened to the words of songs, but I got the tenor of what people were saying, that Dylan didn't like me, that he blamed me for Edie's drugs. And I'll skip ahead a bit. I did eventually find out what Dylan did with that silver Elvis. More than 10 years later, at a time when similar paintings of mine were estimated at 5 or 6 figures, I ran into Dylan at a party in London. He was really nice to me. He was a much friendlier person all around. He admitted that he'd given the painting away to his manager, Al Grossman, and then shook his head regretfully and said, "But if you ever make me another one, Andy, I wouldn't make that mistake again." I thought the story was finished, but it wasn't. Shortly afterward, I happened to be talking to Robbie Robertson, guitarist in the band, and he started to smile when I told him what Dylan had just told me. "Yeah," Robbie laughed, "only he didn't exactly give Grossman the painting. He traded it for a sofa."
Terrible trade. Somebody needs to make that meme. You get high trade.
You get one sofa, you lose a $50 million painting. I mean, not that Dylan
regrets that. Yeah.
I bet not that he's strapped for cash, but I bet he certainly regrets that.
Well, he's another one, and this is something that I think people always have the wrong idea. he's another person who's always been at peace with the fact that art is commercial, as well as being like, he openly kind of tries to ply his living, and he's not kind of blind to the fact that he needs money, basically.
Yeah.
Like, he did a Victoria's Secret advert a while back, which surprised everyone.
Did he?
Didn't. Yeah, it's ridiculous as well. They're like scantily clad women with grumpy old Dylan walking through. I mean, I might play it if I ever do part 3 of Dylan. But anyway, shall we continue on to
Yep. So we
Brando?
had Marlon there. I mean, again, he was he was doing other portraits. He did Warren Beatty and a few other celebrities at the time. But then something happened that brought him, I think, his most famous encounter with a celebrity of all, which was the death, suicide, or whatever, of Marilyn Monroe, which happened in 1962. And, it was the kind of perfect subject for Warhol. I mean, it was, as you said, this absolutely iconic, kind of ineffable, inapproachable beauty and celebrity, but also a kind of person, and a person who had a complete persona created around herself, but also a kind of person that within that persona was extraordinarily fragile and ended up being destroyed by kind of forces out of her control. As we all know later, what associations that she had and the things that sort of eventually kind of destroyed her. And so, this was really the kind of perfect subject for Warhol, because it was both sort of glamour and celebrity and an icon, but also completely laced with death and dread. And this is what I said when I talked about the Elvis with the gun. They're very quickly in Warhol's work, this sense of menace and dread, and this sort of interface with kind of violence and oblivion, in a way, that kind of tied up. I mean, we talked about the kind of hominess of the, this American conception, the Campbell soup and the water heater and all those things, but tied up in this idea of repetition, this idea of, kind of the mass man, the kind of conditions of modernity, the materialism and the kind of the receding of the spirit and the soul from modern conceptions of man. That there is embedded in that something very dark. There is embedded in that, I think, a kind of terrible reality. And so I think, again, that's why I say that Marilyn Monroe was kind of the perfect subject at the perfect time for him, because it was all those things at once, So if you go to the next one, I mentioned this earlier. This is a picture of the church where Warhol went as a child, and you can see that screen is the iconostasis. Basically this screen of icons, and this is what you look at the entire time of the service. The screen between the nave and the sanctuary, and I think that this was very much a kind of influence on the way Warhol saw the celebrity, because in a way that the saints and God himself is sort of the ultimate ineffable celebrity, the ultimate ineffable person. I mean, we're now kind of in the state where we're worshipping Marilyn Monroe and Elvis, but behind that is an ancient and instinctual human desire to kind of worship a deity. And so I think, while you can never say for sure what was intentional in Warhol's work, and or whether it was a critique or whether it was a celebration, but I do think that there is an inherent sadness, and then there is an inherent sense of kind of being lost that comes in there, and ties back to this very ancient tradition that he was a part of.
The worship of entertainers, leaders and singers and so on, is always is like in things like Decline of the West by Spengler or Fate of Empires by Glub. It's always shown as like a kind of sign of decline, that your heroes are no longer warriors, or they're no longer religious figures or prophets or kings. They're literally like people who were like, you know, entertainers who in other times are not exalted in the way
Right.
that they are here, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
Whether
and this
Warhol
sort
was
of
thinking
broken.
about that or not, you know, it still brings
Well,
that to the
yes,
fore.
exactly. We won't know, but I mean, and this is I think one of the most, I mean, literally iconic paintings of that series. You know, I mean, this is again about 6 foot tall, and you know the shiny gold and the face in between, and I think it's sort of an undeniable kind of link between you know the kind of holy and the kind of mundane, and the sacred and the profane in a way. And also, you know, it's very much like a woman staring out of a tomb, a woman, you know, like those coffin portraits that I mentioned earlier in our discussion. You know, it's very much a death's head. So you want to pop on, and again, in true Warhol fashion, he did endless variations on Marilyn and this image.
But you know, you see these colors make her kind of less attractive in my mind somehow.
Yes, I mean
there's something a little bit scary about.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that is again that menace sort of creeping into the work. If you go to the next one,
Here we go. Yeah.
And you know, also, if you look carefully, if you look at the various prints, I mean, they're all very inconsistent. As you print with the silkscreen, you do have to stop occasionally and wash it out because it gets clogged with ink, and so, which of course I think quite deliberately didn't do here. So some of the prints, they're incomplete. Some of them, the impression is too light. Some of it's too dark. The screen gets clogged. You know, it's literally repeating and repeating and repeating this woman, almost as a sort of punishment, as a sort of watching her sort of be degraded by this process of repetition.
But I mean, this is also the newspaper sold on the day of her death,
yeah,
endlessly repeated, or the magazine covers, or the, you know, or in life and in death, I guess. You could see the color as the light and the black and white in death, I guess.
Yeah, and it's funny because people often will say, "Oh, Warhol is so glamorous." I mean, to me, these are horrible images. You know, I mean, they're not glamorous at all. In fact, I also think one of the overarching themes of Warhol's work that crops up again and again, and we'll see it very explicitly later on, is death. I think that his work very quickly becomes a kind of meditation on the transitory nature of life and on death. And so I've never seen these works as kind of glamorous. You know, there's a sort of hard edge.
Downright creepy, to be honest.
Yeah. This one's in America, but there's another one like this that's in the Tate gallery that's even kind of harsher than this one.
There he is with that process you were talking about.
Yes, that's one of the that's the acetate from to produce the silkscreen, and yeah.
Here's another icon
Elizabeth
of that
Taylor.
era.
Yeah, Elizabeth Taylor, and he also produced a whole series of her. He produced paintings of this nature of Natalie Wood as well. This is another. If you go back, hang on, skipped ahead a bit too much. Yeah, this is another kind of the compositional device that he uses, and you'll see it in a few other things, is to pair the painting with an identical canvas that's blank. In this case, it's painted metallic silver. But and again, I think it's asking a kind of a question. I mean, sort of the positive and negative. The being and nothing. The sort of the empty and full. I think that it's
could be a much more superficial and snide joke, D. Which man is going to be here next? Of a 15 different husbands.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sake. But I think that you're absolutely right to go there. In fact, let me just read you. Let me just read you a little quote. David Borden has pointed out that these diptychs, and a diptych just means a painting with two panels, usually the same size. It was a common thing to make altarpieces and such were often produced as diptychs or triptychs. David Borden has pointed out that these diptychs were first created at Warhol's Firehouse studio after Warhol asked his friends, "Wouldn't it be a good idea to add a blank panel?" Adding, "It would make the painting twice as big and twice as expensive."
Right.
So a very big aspect of Warhol's character is his kind of nullification of these kind of philosophical interpretations. I mean, he would very, very often kind of counter-signal these things with the most mundane, most cynical kind of reading possible. You can make the painting twice as big if you put another blank canvas and charge more for it.
Very
You
clever.
get twice as much. 2 for 1. Again, another very American concept.
It's bigger. Okay.
It's bigger.
And
this is actually a spread from Life, I think Life magazine of the time. I can't remember this chap's name, but he was an early collector of pop art. The thing that
this guy plus 20 years absolutely minted when he sold these paintings. But
you want? I was just about to say the amount of money, the amount of future money present in this room. See, I hang on, look up. In the foreground, actually, you can see the Roy Lichtenstein's Nurse. That painting sold at Christie's in 2015 for, you want to guess?
No, I wouldn't.
$95,365,000. It was at the time the 34th most expensive painting ever sold in the history of art. That painting of the Orange Marilyn, I think, is currently owned by hedge fund billionaire Stephen Cohen, who I believe paid something upwards of $100 million for it. So again, unfortunately, this collector, I think he died relatively soon after these pictures were taken, and his collection was sold at the time, in the mid 1960s. So I'm unfortunate for his heirs. Yeah.
Oh well.
Anyway, how are we doing? Are you okay with time?
Shall we end here? Do we think, D, to pick up for next time for part 2? What do you think?
Yeah. Let me just look ahead quickly and see if this is a good place. I'd sort of led up to what I thought was a good endpoint, but I knew I would never get to it because I knew I was going to end up talking so much. Okay, that's.
I always go to a part 3.
Yeah, because we've got quite a lot of material yet to cover. So, but I think it's good. I mean, I think we've certainly established the fundamentals of Warhol's kind of the beginnings of his career, and of course by this time he was starting to to be collected and starting to be quite well known.
Is that Natalie Wood there on the right in this one?
Yes, and that, as I said, that was the kind of third subject of those this series of pictures. Yeah, Natalie Wood, Liz, and Marilyn. So
I'll just say one thing about Natalie Wood. I really don't like her in that movie. What's she in? She really winds me up in that. She's in a film with Brando. Trying to remember which one now. She's in, or is it in Rebel Without Cause?
She's in Rebel Without Cause. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I find her a bit annoying.
I found her annoying because she got in the way of the real romance, which was between Sal Mineo and James Dean. So.
I don't know. There's something about the women in that era. There's another woman who annoys me as well in the On the Waterfront. I forget the love interest there, but she's annoying too.
Yeah.
All right. So only a couple of super chats. Here's the Eunuch says, "I have nothing pithy or clever to say about today's stream. Just wanted to send my appreciation for D putting together this in-depth review of Warhol for us."
Thank you.
Thomas Gans says, R. Green, The Art of Seduction, has Warhol as a master seducer. He hired an impersonator to speak at a lecture tour in his name to foster his mystery.
Yes, he did. Yes, he hired a man called Alan Midget to literally pretend to be him to go on this lecture tour with some unfortunate consequences. I mean, that little action did cost him a bit. Yeah.
And then Benjamin Rood says, "Artwork even worse than my cigar stream, tapped out after 5 minutes. As I said, this is quote unquote art and discourse that steals time, life, rather than giving it." He also says, "Love to you both. AA, stop trolling your audience."
Oh, Benjamin Rood, you bastard! All right.
I thought he was on a redemption trail, but he's turned back on his.
I mean, as I said, something. Obviously, it's not going to be some people's bag. That's fine.
Cringe Walker says JFK had her killed to hide the affair. Methinks that's Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, there's lots of conspiracy theories about that. She. I mean, one of the things we did find out, of course, is that she did have an affair with JFK. So.
Okay. Jedi Knight Anna Cringe Walker also says, "D, thank you for explaining the process in the Monroe works. Feel like I actually value it more now for commenting on life and death and decay."
Oh, thank you indeed for listening, Mr. Cringe Walker.
Thank you very much. And I have declared myself a world-class critic now, D. I mean, not that anyone doubted that already, but I reckon, once I actually got my microphone working and my dad finally stopped bloody doing dishes in the background. Do you have? I mean, we can continue this, in subsequent weeks now that I have all the material. Now that we have all the material.
Yeah.
Yes. I still need to do Bob Dylan Part 3. I keep on forgetting, but that's one day when you can't make it, or when somebody has to cancel, I'll fill in with Bob Dylan Part 3.
I'm looking forward to that. And I would say that the Warhol Dylan. You made a comment about Dylan, which I thought was quite astute, which is that he is one of those kind of artists that is his work is so broad that it's sort of like a once in a lifetime kind of figure. I wouldn't quite say that Warhol is that, because I think that it's slightly a different situation. But I would say that Warhol is probably almost culturally important as Bob Dylan in ways that we'll see. I think that his impact in so many different areas, which is so undeniably and profound, that and strange, of course, that they knew each other and that they were friendly, he and Dylan. So.
Which is not a friendship that you'd think would exist, but I guess it does. They were all in New York at the same time, right?
Yep.
Yes. So yes, there'll be a part 2 soon. if maybe next week.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it next week if you're up for it.
Yep, and probably we'll get to a part 3 as well. I reckon, looking at the sheer amount of material and videos and things that there are here.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, there's, I mean, Warhol was a Promethean sort of figure, and so he had his hands in lots of different pies, so to speak, and yeah. So we haven't even touched on any of that yet. So.
Honestly, I don't care if the audience don't like it. I'm gonna. The deepest lore is not a money-making stream, never has been. So I just plow on regardless.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what these streams have always been, and I think that there are lots of people who like these and enjoy them, and that's who I'm interested in. I don't care if you want to come in, and slag it off. That's perfectly fine. But the people I'm interested in are the people who are going to get something out of this, hopefully.
Yeah, no. So just in terms of wrapping up, tomorrow night I am back on the Scar stream. We are looking at Murray Rothbard's Children and Rights, an extremely controversial chapter from The Ethics of Liberty, which I'm sure you will absolutely hate, D. I mean, just knowing what I know that you don't like libertarians at the best of times, but
yeah.
This is the chapter where Rothbard famously talks about a market for children, and it talks about a fetus being a kind of invasive alien in the mother's body, which she's got a property right to eject if she wants to, and things like this. So we'll be talking about that tomorrow. I've got DG on that stream, and Charlie is coming on as well. Charlie is already absolutely triggered in the chat, as I've seen.
Well, actually, me and Charles had a conversation about this early this morning about libertarians and Rothbards, and I think we were both in agreement. I mean, never trust your ethics to a libertarian, I say.
Yeah, I've never seen Charles so angry. He was pretty angry about that. So that might be an interesting stream. And then, I also have my flash sale. Still going on. Should last until the end of the month at the very least. So if you want £100 off Trivium or Foundations of Econ, still a couple of days to get that. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow, and I'll see you next. I'll see you on Saturday, D. On Saturday, on AA Gold, we'll be on the DVD commentary reviews of Ashes.
More commentary. Yeah, some people like those. Very, very Warholian to use the content, and even more Warholian to use it again afterwards. So.
Yeah, I want to keep on using. I'm going to keep on milking Ashes until people are until there's one person who tunes in. All right. Thank you, everybody. See you again.
Ta-ra.